hope you had a fabulous, fabulous weekend. I hope you were able to get some rest this weekend or do something really fun this weekend. So, today we are going to be talking about nonviolent crisis intervention. I am really excited to be bringing you all this information today. This is actually one of my favorite trainings to do. It has been the one training that I have found the most impactful in my line of work over the last 19 years. It has stuck with me so much that I was just like, I really want to become a trainer, an instructor for this particular training, and I went for it, and it's really packed full of a lot of information. So I am going to say this particular training has a lot of information. And that's typically the one piece of feedback I get from people. They were just like, wow, there was a lot of information jam packed in this. Yes, this training is typically in like a full 8 hours when we do it in person, but virtually, I've been able to, do a little pivot and be able to bring it to people in 3 hours. So we'll be together until noon. And I'm gonna ask for you all to do me a favor because this is a 3 hour training. I really have a note in my notes here to make sure that we have a break, just in case you're looking at the time and you're just like, listen, we need a break. I'm hoping to do put a break in there around like 10:30. We'll take a few minutes to get up, stretch. But just in case you're noticing it's 10:30 and I ain't say a break, let me know so that go ahead and put in the chat like, hey Siobhan, don't forget about our break, because usually when I get into it, I'm just like, I'm going. So that is that. I always like to tell people as well, nonviolent crisis intervention, it is a tool that you can use. It is not the holy grail of tools. I always like to tell people this is just something else you can put into your toolbox and pull it out whenever you need it. I have a lot of people sometimes like ask questions about these things and are really just like, does it really work? And well, I was told at my job I have to use this. So I always tell people, take what you need, put it in your toolbox, and use it whenever you feel like it would be the most useful. Some people may not want to use the full model. That's absolutely fine. Just take what you need. I'm really here to offer you a different perspective about how you think about a crisis, especially among our young people, and also how you deal and respond with a crisis as a staff. So just wanted to put that disclaimer out there. If you all could do me a favor, I know that this will also help Felicia. If you can type your name and then also the organization that you are representing, that it would be the most helpful. It'll be helpful for me as well. Just kind of know who is here, who is in the building. I see some familiar names. So hello, hello again. I see some new names. Hello. If you've never attended a training with me before, my name is Siobhan Dotson. I am right now I'm located in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, where we finally got some sunshine here after I promise you it's been like 3 or 4 days of just gloomy weather. So I'm so happy to see the sun coming out. I have been in the field of youth development for 19 years. It is honestly the first job I got coming out of high school directly into college. I worked with an after school program on my college campus, and I have been addicted to this line of work ever since. So I've always worked in the field of youth development in some way, shape, or form. And I've had so many different roles, probably every role that you can think of in this field, from, a tutor to a volunteer to summer camp staff to manager, director, facility management. So I've done a lot of things, held a lot of roles, but I'm really excited to now be in this role as a facilitator and helping, train up the another level of youth development professionals and really aid in people's professional development. So I am excited to be here with you all. I've enjoyed the last few days I've had with you all, and I am ready to go. So good morning, Sarah from SLYC. Good morning, Lisa from YMCA. Good morning, Dolly from Lifehouse Maternity Home. Good morning, Marcus from Youth Build. Teresa from Youth Book. Good morning. Good morning, Christy from the Kentucky Division of Behavioral Health. Good morning, Eltwan from True Up Louisville and Sweet Evening Breeze. All right, so good morning. Good morning, everyone. So before we get started, I am going to pop a poll into our chat. There's a link there. I want you to go ahead, if you're able to, follow that link. It's going to take you over to a Slido. And this is going to kind of be our icebreaker question for this morning. If you're not able to access that link, I'm going to read the question for you here, and you can feel free to type it into the chat. So our question for this morning is, what is one thing you are hoping to learn from today's workshop on nonviolent crisis intervention? So what's one thing you're hoping to learn from our workshop today on nonviolent crisis intervention? I will give you a minute to answer that. Good morning, Michelle from 7 Counties and Goodwill Industries of Kentucky. I see some answers starting to come in here. All right, so I see some people saying they're hoping to learn some de-escalation tips. Someone says some calming techniques. I see someone saying strategies on dealing with youth who have spikes in behavior. I'm hoping to learn de-escalation skills, how to safely and respectfully de-escalate situations. All right. So this is helpful to kind of know what you're looking to learn, what you're hoping to learn here this morning. And my goal is to meet those expectations, right? So my goal is to hopefully teach you some really great de-escalation techniques. We're also going to identify a crisis, like how a crisis develops. Someone says something that I didn't know before. Someone else says appropriately diffusing a situation, tricks for de-escalating conflict, new skills and techniques, how to better meet people where they are when they have a crisis need. Awesome. Thank you all for that. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I am going to pull up my screen here. I'm going to share my screen in a minute. But before I share my screen, I want to, we're going to start thinking about your experience, right? Or maybe some situations you've been in when we're thinking about dealing with a crisis situation, or even thinking about like a stressful or challenging situation when that has maybe been just a challenge for you. So I'm going to pop another link in here into our chat, and I would love for you all to answer this here question, and I'll read it to you as well for those who cannot access the link. So I want you to think about a time at work when you felt distressed or challenged by someone's behavior. How did you respond? So I'm actually going to pop that question into the chat as well for those who can't access the link. So think about a time at work when you felt distressed or challenged by someone's behavior. How did you respond? And I'm going to be quiet and give you a minute to ponder on that and to answer. I'm going to give you all about 30 more seconds for that. I see some really great answers coming. All right. So I see someone says they felt defensive. Okay. Here we are, some more answers. I typically back down. I do not like confrontation, but there are situations in which I know I need to take charge. All right. Someone else says defensive. Someone says I try to take a short break from the situation, then return to address the concern once I am emotionally more calm. Someone else says got frustrated and probably cried, calmly walked away. Someone says I tend to suffer in silence. Someone says had a calm tone and didn't respond aggressively. All right. Someone else says take note of the situation and monitor for next moves, check biases and anxiety. All right. So a lot of different ways that we typically handle crisis situation. And my goal here is to give you some tools to we're going to talk about how to start kind of identifying when a crisis is developing. And then also to be able to give you some tools that you can use when you're responding to different types of crisis, right? There are different levels in the development of a crisis. And when we think about those different levels, there are different ways and more appropriate ways for us to respond depending on what the behavior is that we see. So that is what we're going to explore today. We're not going to do any breakout rooms today. Like I said, this is a lot of information I'm going to give you all. I am going to be asking just for some of your feedback, asking you all as you feel comfortable to share your experiences maybe with this information, or if you've been in a similar situation, or I really want you to think about the target demographic that you work with and how you'd be able to implement, if not all of this technique, at least maybe some parts of the technique in the work that you do. And at any time, if you have any questions or anything like that, you can absolutely feel free to ask them. You can unmute yourself, or you can type it into the chat. So let me get this going here. All right, here we are. Good morning. This is Nonviolent Crisis Intervention Training. And this training was created by the Crisis Prevention Institute. They have a lot of really great trainings, but this one right here, Nonviolent Crisis Intervention, is really my favorite. And today we're going to really focus on verbal interventions. Let me also take a poll in from you all so I can get a better understanding of kind of what goes on in your organization. Go ahead and type into the chat for me if your organization is a hands-off organization, which means that you take a hands-off approach to de-escalating crisis, or if you do restraints. So let me know, are you all hands off or do you perform restraints in your organization? Type that into the chat for me just so I can understand kind of where we are. All right, I see a lot of people typing hands off, hands off, hands off, hands off. Okay. So I wanted to check because we are focusing on the hands-off approach. Now, the full gamut of this training, we do teach restraints, but because I know that I do this training for a lot of people in the out of school time field, and we typically always take the none, the hands-off approach, non-restraint approach. I cater this to really focus on verbal interventions. So that's what we're going to be highlighting today. I just wanted to get a sense of um, where people were and their approach to crisis. So this is very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for that. All right. So there are some guidelines here that I just want to go over with you. And it's really just about being professional, respectful of everyone. Now, if we hit on something that's a really sensitive topic for you, you can feel free to private message me. If you're just like, hey, Shavon is a little too touchy, I'm not gonna, I don't feel comfortable sharing. That is absolutely fine. Definitely want you to be comfortable, take care of yourself. Sometimes this information can get a little heavy. So if you need to get up, walk away at any point, kind of shake it off and come back, feel free to do this as well. We really want to focus on just the safety, emotional safety, right? Psychological safety as well. And we're also going to talk about ensuring that we prioritize physical safety when we're going over this information, So at any time, if you have a question about anything, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself. All right, so here it is right here. This says all behavior is a form of communication, which is absolutely true. We kind of touched on this a little bit last Friday, in one of our sessions when we were, when the quote popped up about our youth. They're not trying to necessarily make our lives difficult, but they're always communicating with their behavior from a place of need. They're needing something. So all behavior, whether you like the behavior or not, whether you think it's great behavior or whether you don't think it's great behavior, it is a form of communication. So I'm going to ask you before we move on, I want you to go ahead and think about a time where you've, experienced some level of aggression or maybe violence. I want you to define that. Like in your mind, how do you define aggression? So go ahead and, just from your experience, define aggression for me. It can be one word, it could be a phrase, doesn't matter, doesn't have to be Webster's, dictionary definition, but I want you to define aggression for me. Lisa says anger. All right, Elton says defensive emotional display. Dolly says yelling, threatening. All right, Antonio says aggressive tone and or language, cursing, derogatory terms, facial expressions. Okay. All right, Teresa says threatening. Lisa says body language. All right, Michelle says body tense, verbalizations are loud, body posture, anxious. So now what I want you all to do is define violence, right? What is that definition for you? Define violence from your experience or whatever you have, had any type of experience with. Define violence. For aggression, Aaron says at the end / peak of emotional outbursts, moving towards me quickly with hands up. Okay. All right, so for violence, Michelle says hitting, hurting self or others, throwing items, punching. Lisa says harm. Eltawan says, again, aggressive, emotional display. Violence equals violating safety, from Antonio. Laura says harm to self or others. Aaron says violence, using your body to cause harm to others. Christy says impending harm. So now think about in the workplace. And you don't have to share this in the chat, but I just want you to think about what types of aggression have you experienced or have you been subjected to? What forms of violence do you typically see in your workplace? Antonio says microaggressions. Ooh, Elswan says yelling. So I want you to think about what that looks like in your program or in your organization. What does aggression typically look like? What does violence typically look like? And kind of keep that in your mind as we're going through this training. So here it says aggression can be defined as behavior that is characterized by vigorous, intense, or hostile actions. Now, violence can be defined as any behavior where force is used to injure or abuse another person, usually intending to cause injury. I also now want you to think about, we're thinking about your place of work, right? Michelle says throwing chairs, kicking staff, punching at walls, or staff screaming or cursing at others. I want you to think about, what are the core values that underpin your work? What are the core values that underpin your work? So basically, what are your core values? What are your organizational core values? Do you know? Type that into the chat for me, thinking about core values. You can type your personal core values if you feel comfortable, or if you know your organizations, type those as well. Lisa says respect, caring, honesty, responsibility. Treat others with respect, meet people where they are, be present and engage with participants. Eltwan says compassion, accountability. Teresa says respect and accountability. Aaron says intellectual freedom, dignity, respect, privacy. Dolly says life, empathy, respect, empowerment. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your core values with me. And why do we talk about core values, right? So core values really influence how you're going to respond to any type of aggression. It's going to influence how you respond to any type of violence, around you, in your organization, in your workplace. So when you think about, these interventions that we're going to be talking about, your core values, whatever you believe, whatever your organization believe, they're absolutely going to be at the forefront of your mind when you're looking to respond. So if you have amazing core values, if you're just like, at the end of it, I really want to maintain respect and accountability, or empathy, respect, and empowerment, then yes, I am going to really make sure that I respond, keeping those things in mind, where I am presenting empathy, where I am making sure that I'm respecting people, or I am highlighting intellectual freedom and dignity, or I'm really, keeping in the forefront of your mind that I want to give you some privacy. So just kind of keep those in mind as well as we go through this. So all behavior is a form of communication. Here are the Crisis Prevention Institute. These are their core values: care, welfare, safety, and security. So this approach that we're talking about, that I'm going to be sharing with you, this intervention, will always keep in mind the care, the welfare, safety, and security of all those involved. So when we think about care, it's the respect, dignity, empathy, and we want to make sure it's person-centered. So thinking about what that person needs at the time. Welfare, maintaining independence, choice, and well-being. Safety, protecting rights and minimizing harm. And then security, safe, effective, harmonious, and collaborative relationships. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to show you and share with you a little bit about postvention, as we call it. Like, what do you do post-crisis? So we're going to explore that also. Here we are, module 1. We're going to start out talking about this crisis development model. I'm going to hide this chat really quick so I can see my full screen. All right. This is it. This is the entire method right here, the crisis development model. So you see, there are 4 different levels according to Crisis Prevention Institute and the Nonviolent Crisis Intervention. There are 4 behavior levels when we think about the development of a crisis. Now, with those 4 behavior levels, there are 4 staff attitudes or approaches that you should have when you're responding to these different behavior levels. So the first one is anxiety. That's the first behavior level when we think about the way a crisis developed. And the staff attitude or staff approach, when we notice that anxiety, should be a supportive approach. And we're going to go deeper into each of these levels. For the second level, which is defensive behaviors, the staff attitude approach, when we start seeing defensive behaviors, you're going to want to be directive, right? Give a directive. And we're going to explore that in all of the verbal interventions that we're going to talk about. Now, behavior level 3, risk behavior. We're going to talk about what that looks like. And then also, what's important to know that for level 3, when it says risk behavior, when you start to see those risk behaviors, that's when a safety intervention is needed. And if you are an organization that takes more of a hands-off approach, you're going to have to think about what different safety interventions will you need to utilize that may be appropriate for your protocol, right? Because I always like people to know, well, what's going to be your plan? And if you see each and every one of these behavior levels developing, what's your plan for each approach? And if you're like, hey, well, we have to take a hands-off approach because risk behaviors, they happen sometimes, then I want you all to know exactly what the proper protocol is in your organization for safety interventions. Do you call somebody, whatever? Like, we're going to talk a little bit about that and explore that for your organization. Disclaimer, every organization was going to have a different protocol or a different approach, and that is absolutely fine. Then the second level of crisis development, it's tension reduction. And that's when we want to start having, therapeutic rapport, reestablish that rapport with our person in crisis. So here's the thing about this model. As you can see, you see these arrows going back and forth. That basically means that this is an integrated experience. We're going to go back and forth with these, right? So you'll see anxiety, then you wanted to be supportive. You might go back to still seeing some anxiety. And I also want you to know that there is no time limit for, how these behaviors start to present themselves. I'm not going to tell you that, well, typically when you see anxiety, they might be in anxiety for 5 minutes. I have no clue. This is really just to get you thinking about this being, a development. So there is no particular time limit. Someone might go from anxiety and then, they might go 1, 2, 3, 4, like really quickly. It might be something that's been brewing all day, but it's literally about going back and forth with this. So it is an integrated experience where you're going to always be tapping into these resources and modifying your approach based on whichever behavior level you might be experiencing at the time. So we're going to dive a little bit into this, right? So I want you to think about the fact that, once again, there are different, behaviors for each individual experience that might be in crisis. And then also, this really introduces the idea that there's a relationship between how you respond and the way that the behavior might develop. And different relationships and different, behaviors, of course, will require different interventions, different staff attitudes. So think about the relationship that you have with your young people or you have with your participants. Think about those relationships. Do you have a very supportive relationship? Do you have really great rapport with them? Because that is going to come into play when we talk about staff approaches. All right. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Like, how do you get along with your participants? All right. So anxiety here. Anxiety basically means a change in typical behavior. That's it, right? A change in typical behavior. That is anxiety. And when you think about changes in the behavior, it can be subtle changes. When we think about anxiety, it doesn't have to be this big display. It can be something that is really, really small. Maybe usually they come in and high five you. And today they didn't come in and high five you. Instead, they came in and they sat down immediately and they were very quiet. They were withdrawing. That is a sign of anxiety. That is a change in their typical behavior. So when we think about this change in behavior, I want you to think about a non-directed expenditure of energy, pacing, tapping the fingers, right? Or moving, your hands or something like that, pacing back and forth, staring off, crying, right? Silence, that withdrawal, that can be some type of sudden change in behavior. And it's easier to identify those changes of behavior when you actually have a relationship with the individual, when it's an individual that you see every day, or you're well aware of the typical energy that they might enter your space with. So it's easier for you all to be able to tell when that type of energy has all of a sudden changed, when that behavior is like, oh, okay, well, there's something different about you today. Go ahead and type into the chat, if you will, some examples that maybe you have experienced of anxiety, your participants having some level of anxiety. Go ahead and type that into the chat. What has that looked like in your programs? Eltawan says outbursts. Yeah. Okay. Dolly says not following directions, arguing with staff. Teresa's crying, withdrawn, irritability. Sarah says student not answering messages like they usually do. Aaron says with youth typically quieter or withdrawn. Lisa says, ooh, sudden stomach ache. Good one, Lisa. You're right. Sometimes we see these anxieties manifest themselves in the physical form. All of a sudden, right? You don't feel well. All of a sudden, something's wrong. You have a headache, or you have a stomach ache, when typically they're really high energy. So these are great. Thank you all for sharing. So when you think about this level of anxiety, this change in typical behavior, once again, building those relationships with those in your care, that's a huge asset to you being able to identify when these changes in behavior might take place, because this will be your opportunity to really intervene really early. So kind of just keying in on your students and how they interact with you, how they interact with one another. Someone else says not staying in a typical area or with their typical group. That can be a sudden change in behavior, wandering off, right? So what is the staff approach when we talk about anxiety? So the appropriate staff response or staff approach is a supportive one. So you want that approach to be an empathetic, non-judgmental approach. So this is an opportunity for us to alleviate the anxiety, right? An attempt for us to alleviate that anxiety. And this is really where we start listening. We allow time, right? So if you notice that there is this sudden change of behavior, instead of going in with the didn't I tell you to get over here and yada yada yada, if you see like, hey, this is not typically what this person does, that can be a quick sign to you to say, hey, there is something else brewing. Something is starting to go on. So you want to make sure, and I saw some of you type this into the chat about your core values, empathy. So you want to take an empathetic, non-judgmental, Eltwan says, right, non-judgmental, yeah, a non-judgmental approach. And this is a really great time to do a check-in. Type into the chat for me, any of you who, feel led to, how do check-ins look in your program? How do check-ins look in your program? Sarah says, hey, are you doing okay? Is there anything you need? Lisa says, asking youth what has happened or what's going on. And I love to remind people check-ins don't have to be some big drawn out thing, right? There's so many different creative ways that we can just do a mental health check-in with our young people. Dolly says asking questions. Laura says one-on-one conversations. And depending on your age group, you might have to get really creative. There was one person in one of my trainings, and they worked with like kindergartners, that age group that they really don't have the words to really kind of tell you exactly what's going on, or they may not have the words to let you know if something is wrong. We just see this anxiety. We just see a lot of these changes in behavior. And one of the tools that they used, they said that they have emoji posters, right? And every day when the young people come in, the kindergartners come in, they ask their young people, all right, point to an emoji, point to a smiley face, right? That lets me know how you're feeling today. That is a check-in. That is a check. Just like when you go to the doctor and they ask you, hey, what is your, tell me your pain level. Are you like super sad, crying face, or, are you happy face, whatever. So that is a really quick way to do a check-in, just to say, all right, how are you feeling today? If I know that Susie usually, points to the smiley face emoji, and then she comes into the program and maybe Susie's 5, and today Susie points to the straight face emoji, well, then there's something going on there. Now Susie's 5. Susie might not, go and tell me everything that's going on. I might start to see that, because remember, all behavior is a form of communication. I might start to see that played out in her behavior, where I would have to remember, you know what? She did come in today and say that, she was, not happy, not sad. She was a straight face emoji. So let me kind of watch out and see what's going on and make sure that I am really being super supportive today. And it might be, let me sit down and talk to her, or let me see what's going on. Someone says, also one says eye contact. Erin says, I usually redirect. Hey, I was reading this comic, want to check it out? You're doing okay. Teresa says calling, texting, after long or frequent absences, having a one-on-one if I notice that they're off. Great. So different ways that people check in. So if you're noticing some of these levels of anxiety, whatever your check-in is, feel free to do a check-in, because you really want to listen to what's going on. You want to find out, well, what's going on with you? How can I support you? And then sometimes you might just need to give them time. You might allow them time to be able to work through whatever emotions they might be experiencing. Because in my experience, sometimes people don't even know. They may not even be able to name the emotion. And that's with grown-ups and with young people. Where it's just like, I don't really know how I'm feeling. I know that I'm not feeling like my normal self. I've noticed, especially during this pandemic, really had to ramp up my check-ins, because during this entire time of being stuck in the house and so many things have changed, anxiety has been looking really, really different, not only for myself and my own household, but also in other people who I interact with. Anxiety has been showing up in so many different ways. And I have noticed and learned that sometimes they can't even put words to it. It's just like, you know what, Siobhan, I don't even know how I'm feeling today. I just know that I don't feel like my normal self, right? Like I just don't feel like, I'm just not in that mood to talk. Maybe I'm not in the mood, to do anything, to engage. So how can you provide this this empathic, non-judgmental approach? How can you still have empathy? Sometimes that might look like sitting next to them and sitting in silence. I always tell people it's amazing what silence can mean in a situation. Sometimes when we're asking all the questions, hey, what's wrong with you? Are you gonna tell me what's going on with you today? How you feeling today? Sometimes all of those questions can be overwhelming. Sometimes silence is all you need. Sometimes your physical presence is the thing to do. If you notice that someone is withdrawn, a supportive approach might be you going over. If you can even ask, hey, what's going on with you today? If they don't feel like chatting, maybe you sit down and say, is it okay if I sit with you in silence? Is that okay? Maybe they might say yes. Maybe they might say no. Maybe you need to allow them time and space to process whatever it is that they need to process. It's okay to say, all right, well, if do you need a minute? Do you need a little bit of time to deal with your emotions and then be able to join us? Maybe they say yes, maybe they say no. But I want you all to start thinking about the different ways that you can be supportive to the target population that you work with. What will work for that? Someone, Lisa says, when you are ready, I am here. And again, this goes along with building those relationships. You'll really know how to be supportive if you have an idea as to, how this person might respond, or a little bit about this with this, a little bit about this person, and you've built a trusting relationship. When we've been talking about all of the youth work methods, and what's also been a highlight is making sure that we have that youth adult partnership. We're building those relationships to say, hey, I want you to know I'm here to support you. I want you to know that I'm on your side. I'm here to encourage you. And when you take those approaches, then it's easier to figure out what level of support you might need in the situation. All right, the second behavior level that we're going to explore is defensive, right? So when you see this behavior level, that's them protecting oneself from a real or perceived challenge or danger. I want to really highlight the term perceived, because at this stage, that's when you might tend to see someone becoming really belligerent. That's when you might see them starting to challenge authority. You might see some refusal. This is also when you'll start to see that shouting. I saw some of you talking about yelling, right? Those are defensive behaviors. But I want to highlight again the word perceived, because someone will start to be defensive when they believe that they are in danger, or when they believe that there is a challenge present. It's not what you believe, right? So people get defensive when it's a real challenge, a real threat, a real danger, also a perceived one. And this takes some discussion to figure out, okay, what are you perceiving? How are you perceiving the situation? Because they might really believe that they're in danger and that they need to protect themselves. So when we see this defensive behavior, like I said, it can be yelling, screaming, they can start to get an attitude, cursing, is what you will see when you start to see this defensive behavior as well. The appropriate staff approach is a directive. You need to provide clear direction or instruction. And we are going to really spend some time diving into the way defensive behaviors show up and the way that we respond, providing you with some tools that you can use that will allow you to provide clear direction or instruction. Dolly says perception is reality. Yes, it absolutely is. It really, really is. And I still have to remind myself of that when I'm dealing with people. And I'm talking about not even just young people, even with adults, right? As adults, we perceive things so differently. So I always have to remind myself that doesn't matter what I'm saying or what I'm showing you. What I need to understand is, how are you perceiving this? Are you perceiving me as a threat? Are you perceiving this as a challenging situation? Because that is going to influence that person's behavior. So this is the second level of the crisis development model. We see the defensive behavior, and as a staff approach, we want to take that directive approach. The third level, risk behavior, that is when behavior starts to present an imminent or immediate risk to self or others. That is when you start to see the kicking, right? You might start to see throwing stuff. That's at that point when you see a risk behavior, they have lost total control. That can result in the physical behavior, where you're throwing things, you're kicking. And at this point, you might really need a physical intervention in order to minimize harm. So biting, self-injury is also a risk behavior, right? Hitting, like I said, throwing things. So the appropriate staff approach in response to that is a safety intervention, which is a non-restrictive or restrictive strategy to maximize safety and minimize harm. Now, we are not going to go into the restraints, because this is generally when we start talking about restraints. We're not going to go into restraints. But I do like to highlight this behavior level because it happens so often in programs. It happens with our youth when we start seeing a lot of these risk behaviors. And the one thing I like to do is to challenge people to think about what is the appropriate process for how you're expected to handle this situation. Every organization on this training is, you all are different. So the expectation is going to be different. The protocol is going to be different. But I really encourage you to go figure out. You might need to ask your supervisor, right? Maybe you need to go back to the handbook. I don't know. Maybe you know what the process is, but ask the questions. Hey, when we start to see these risk behaviors, and according to this training that I just took, they say when we start to see risk behaviors, in order to maximize safety and minimize harm, we need a safety intervention. What does that look like for our organization? What's the expectation for that? I encourage you to ask those questions if you're unsure. Because again, the goal here is to maximize safety and minimize harm. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that can look like in your organizations, or from your experience, what that might look like. And then the fourth level here, tension reduction. At this point in the crisis, that is when you start to see the decrease in physical and emotional energy. Now, the thing to note is that tension reduction might look a lot like anxiety. You might see crying. You might see the withdrawal. You might see they might apologize. You might see it, like I said, physically. They might have been like really stiff, and all of a sudden, you might see the body relax. So this typically occurs after the person has really escalated. They've really just gone through it, and they've given out so much energy. Now it's just like, okay, I have depleted all of that energy. Maybe I had so much physical energy in me, I needed to move it around. So, I've gotten that energy out. I've gotten those emotions out. Now I'm starting to gain some form of rationality, right? I'm starting to be able to kind of think about things, and regain control of my emotions, maybe regain control of some of my thoughts, regain control of, my physical body. You might see signs of remorse with this. Like, you might see some confusion. Some people, when they really hit peak crisis level, they might black out and might not even remember what happened. So they might be a little confused, like, wait, what just went on? What just happened? Like I said, you might see people apologizing, like, oh, I'm so sorry. I can't believe I just did that. What's the appropriate staff response? Therapeutic rapport. Reestablish the relationship. You want to reestablish communication. You want to listen, right? You also want to debrief. Now, this is when we're going to talk about postvention, because it's also important to really debrief the situation. When I typically do these, I always ask people, like, well, when the crisis is over, like, what do you do? Some people are just like, yeah, I tell them go back to class. I high five them and be like, all right, well, cool. So we're going to talk about the importance of debriefing and what that can look like, debriefing with staff, and also debriefing with the individual, and the importance of making sure you reestablish that line of communication with them. Because honestly, if we skip out on this approach right here, you can kick someone right back into, the crisis developing all over again. So it's important that we take the time to really reestablish that line of communication with them, and let them know, hey, I'm still here to support you. You might have just tore this room up. I'm still here to support you. I'm still here. Let's talk about it. So again, when we think about this integrated experience, your approach can absolutely influence a person's behavior. So I want you to know that if you are approaching someone who has anxiety, if you are approaching them with directives, then you might start to see them get defensive, right? Because if they weren't in the behavior level of defensive, then you shouldn't be approaching them with a directive. Because if that's how you approach them, then you have now caused them to be defensive. If you are approaching someone who's just showing signs of anxiety, if you approach them with a safety intervention, that's when you're going to start to see risk behaviors. They might not have been showing those before. All of a sudden now, yeah, they're kicking, they're screaming, they're, because they feel like they are in danger. They started to lose, all of a sudden now they are losing control. All right, so we're gonna do. I like to go to this one. Just a quick scenario, and feel free to unmute yourself and talk, or you can type. So here's our scenario here. A parent waits to meet with her son's teacher. This is the third time in a month she's been called into the office regarding her son's performance. She's a single mother working 2 jobs and had to take time off work to be here. She's pacing, fidgeting with her phone, and constantly asking the school secretary where the teacher is. When the teacher arrives, the parent yells at her for wasting her time when she should be at work. When asked to work with her son to complete supplemental worksheets to help him improve his math scores, she argues, "I don't have time for this. Isn't this your job?" All right, so let's look at this scenario here, case study, as you will. What are some, we're talking a little bit about, this crisis development model. So we talked about what anxiety can look like. Someone type into the chat for me, or unmute yourself and let me know. What were some signs of anxiety that she was exhibiting? This parent. Lisa says pacing. What are some signs of anxiety that this parent was exhibiting that would let us know something's going on? Dolly says, asking the secretary where the teacher was, pacing, fidgeting, constantly asking. All right. What we talked about: anxiety, defensive, risk behavior, tension reduction. We talked about those things. Outside of anxiety, do you see any other behavior levels here? Do you see any defensive behavior levels? Do you see any risk behaviors? Do you see some tension reduction? Do you see other behavior levels here? So her constantly asking, right, can be defensive. Oh, so Chrissy says this is the third time at the school in a month. So that might let us know something. That might give us an idea as to how this person might be feeling by the time they get up to the school. All right, so it says, so Aaron says here, defensive, blaming teacher for missing work, yelling at teacher. All right, so what do you think about the teacher's response? How do you feel the teacher responded? It says when the teacher arrives, the parent yells at her for wasting her time and she should be at work. So apparently we could tell the teacher asked the mom to work with her son to complete these worksheets to help him improve his math scores. And then the mom was, arguing with her. So what do we think about the teacher's response? Do you feel like the teacher responded appropriately? Do you feel like the teacher could have responded in a different way? Christy says too much, too fast. Christy, what do you mean by that? If you don't mind expanding on that thought, what do you mean by too much, too fast?
She didn't check in with the mom at all. She immediately got down to business and didn't, see where the parent was at.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. Christy, I wholeheartedly agree with you, right? Now, if we're looking at what is given in this scenario, someone pointed out this was the mom's third time at the school in a month. Christy pointed that out. She said, this is the mom's third time at the school in a month. Now, I don't know about y'all. I don't know if you all are parents or caregivers of young people, but when you got to take off of work to go up to your child's school for the third time in a month, listen, I know I probably would be up at that school feeling some type of way as well. Soon as I got the call to come up there, I'm sure I would be feeling all type of emotions myself. So Chrissy says like she got directly into business and she didn't do a check-in with the parent. Lisa says parent probably felt she was told to do something. Ooh, telling, right? That's good. Because now we talked about some of these behavior levels, and if we see that she was showing some signs, some anxiety signs, and the parent, the teacher directly went in with the directive instead of being supportive because we see those signs of anxiety, then it's like, well, if you come at me with the directive, then I'm going to show you some defensive behaviors. Good. Okay, Lisa. Aaron says, not sure asking her to work on a worksheet during an emergency meeting is appropriate or a good use of time. Right? So Aaron says, like, was it really, did you really have to come up to the school just to tell the parent, like, to do some worksheets? So, maybe understanding where the parent might be coming from. Teresa says, teacher failed to acknowledge the parent's frustration before making an ask of the parent. So this is great feedback. And I love to use this particular scenario because if you work in a school or, a lot of the work that we do with young people, we've probably seen something that looks like this. Maybe not this particular thing, but we have seen parents come into the building and they already live it. They already upset for whatever reason. We don't know. But if they come in already on 1,000, we have to be very cognizant and mindful of what our approach is. Because when we look at what's given here, we know that she's a single mom and she works 2 jobs and she had to take time off from work just to be at the school. She's pacing, she's fidgeting, constantly trying to figure out like, yo, where is the teacher? Right? Where is this teacher? Now, y'all done had me come up here. Where is she at? So that we see those, anxiety levels. And it seems that the teacher immediately comes in and hit her with a directive. She didn't take the time to provide that supportive approach. I'm not seeing any signs of empathy here. So because she took a directive approach, the mom was like, she got defensive. What? Ain't that your job? You supposed to be doing that. Now, I'll also say that it seems like, and we know staff get busy. Sometimes as soon as someone comes, we can't always just drop what we're doing. But it seems as if that the mom, she was waiting. She had to wait for the teacher. So not only did you tell me to come up to the school, because I had to take off work, you're not even ready to have the conversation when I come up here. And it seems like the teacher didn't take the time to even address that. Maybe throw some apologies, like I apologize, running late. Or maybe the teacher should have made it a priority. If the parent had to make it a priority to take off work, maybe the teacher should have made it a priority to meet her in the office. But I will say I enjoy Aaron's perspective to say that not sure asking this mom to work on a worksheet with her child is the best way to use this time, with this emergency meeting. Like, oh, if you had to take off work to come up here only to tell me to do some worksheets, like maybe we could have used this time to explore some other approaches or really dig deep at what's going on. Yeah, Aaron says it's disrespectful of the parents' time and priorities. I agree. All right, so we talked about the behavior levels of crisis, that we saw. We kind of explored like some of the staff approaches that needed to be taken during during this particular scenario. All right. So it says, what would you say or do here? I think me personally, I definitely would have taken that supportive approach. And I see a lot of you saying like, listen, wasn't a great use of time, did a little bit too much too fast, didn't acknowledge the parents' frustrations before making an ask of the parent. Like, So she should have done those things. She should have acknowledged the parents' frustration. She should have done a check-in, right? She probably shouldn't have gone directly into, well, here's what you need to do. And I agree. I think that the parent should have thought about the best use of the parent's time. Teachers should have been like, all right, if I'm making you come up to the school, how can we really best use this time? Especially if I know this isn't the first time I've asked you to come up here, or someone has asked you to come up here. You've been up here 3 times, it's the third time already. So how can we really make sure that we make it intentional? We make it very purposeful. All right, here we'll do a quick knowledge check. When an individual is demonstrating behavior such as kicking and biting, they are displaying what? What behavior level are they displaying if they are doing behavior such as kicking and biting? Is it anxiety? Is it defensive, risk behavior, or tension reduction? A, B, C, or D? See the answers coming in here. I see people saying it is C, risk behavior. You're right. When we start to see the physical aggression, right? That you are kicking, you're biting, you're hitting, you're throwing things, an intent to bring injury or harm to self or others. That is a risk behavior. An individual is looking at the clock and pacing back and forth. What behavior level is that person exhibiting? Anxiety, defensive, risk behavior, or tension reduction? All right, they're looking at the clock, pacing back and forth. What behavior level is that? All right, I see people typing in. That is A, anxiety. And you are right. That is another example of anxiety. They're pacing, they keep looking at something, keep staring off at something. And we know that when we start to see those behaviors, we need to take a very supportive approach. We need to come in, we need to listen, figure out maybe what's going on, maybe allow them a little bit of space. How would you respond to help an individual who is saying no and refusing to perform a task? Would you provide supportive words and an attitude? Would you B, call for help? Would you C, provide choices with consequences? Or would you D, reestablish the relationship? If you are seeing the refusal and they're saying, no, I'm not going to do this, what would you do? Would you be very supportive? Would you call for help, provide choices with consequences, or reestablish that relationship? So see, some people said, hey, I would do supportive words and attitude. Actually, the correct answer is C. Yep, you want to provide choices with consequences, that you want to give a directive. When you start seeing the refusal, that is defensive behavior. So we want to give a directive. We want to provide a choice and go over the consequences with you and allow you to choose. And we're going to talk about that and explore that when we go into verbal interventions. All right, so we talked about key takeaways here is just to remember that when we think about that crisis, there are 4 different behavior levels that we see and 4 different staff responses that we see as well. And also remember that your response can influence that person's behavior, just like their behavior is going to influence your response. So we see that integrated experience there. So let's talk about this integrated experience. Your approach changes everything. And we saw an example of that with the teacher and the parent. The teacher seemed like she hopped right into, well, let me tell you what to do, and did not take a supportive approach at all. Therefore, the parent met her with some defensive behavior. She started yelling and, you what? And that's your job, right? And that's kind of like a refusal. I'm not about to do this because that's what you're supposed to be doing. So your approach, it can change everything. So we're going to talk a little bit about nonverbal communications during interventions. We're going to talk about personal space, and we're gonna get into those things and how they also influence uh, your approach. It influences the person's behavior as well. I know when we talked about what aggression, what does that look like? Antonio typed in their facial expression, so we're going to talk about the nonverbals and explore what that can look like and how impactful that can be. So we know this integrated experience, right? So your approach can influence their behavior. Their behavior is going to influence your approach. That basically means behavior influences behavior. If you come into work one day and you are just really not feeling it, you like, listen, I'm sleepy. I ain't had no sleep all night. And then you start to see someone exhibiting some defensive behaviors. If you go straight into safety intervention because you just like, I don't want to deal with it, not today. Not about to deal with this today, Antonio. Right? If you go directly into a safety intervention, they are going to meet you then with some risk behaviors. They might be like, see, I wasn't even going there right now. But when you meet a behavior, if you're meeting a behavior and it's the wrong response to that behavior, the crisis is going to further escalate. You're going to really just continue to trigger them. And by that point, when we see risk behaviors, now that person is really at the peak of their crisis. They're at the peak of that crisis development, and all rationale has gone out the door. So telling somebody to calm down when you start to see that's not going to work, because they are like at peak level and they really can't hear anything. They can't process any commands or directives you're trying to give them, because they are really at peak level. That's when a lot of that emotional and physical energy is going to just show up. So just keep that in mind, that if you are not giving the appropriate response for the behavior level, they're going to give you the behavior level that that you're asking for, basically. So what are some factors that might negatively impact your ability to remain consistent and calm in your responses? So look at these and let's be honest, right? This is a safe space. I will tell you that, a very safe space. So I want you to be honest with yourself, most importantly, and think about what factors might negatively impact your ability to remain consistent and calm in your responses. Waking up late, right here, lack of caffeine, not enough sleep, family stress. Maybe you don't feel well. Maybe you're trying to fit too much into one day. Maybe you got some interpersonal conflicts going on at work. Maybe there was a traffic jam. Maybe there's some work dissatisfaction. So which one of these factors might negatively impact your ability to remain consistent in response? They don't have that. So the truth is all of these, right? These are all factors that can absolutely impact our ability to remain consistent. And some of the other workshops and trainings we were doing, we were talking about consistency. That word kept coming up, like consistent in how we interact with our young people, consistent in how we respond. This is the same way. You can't respond to one thing, one crisis, one way, one day, see the same crisis happen the next day, and now you like, okay, now I'm sick of it. I'm about to go off. I sat in traffic for 2 hours trying to get to work today. I didn't have enough sleep. I already don't feel well. I got a headache. Y'all better, right? Like, that is not the way that you should be responding to that behavior. But we know, like, if we're being honest, all of these things can absolutely impact our ability. So it's important for us to really check ourselves. And these things are called precipitating factors. Factors that influence behaviors, because we are only human and we have things going on personally in our lives as well. So precipitating factors, understanding those factors helps you to avoid becoming a precipitating factor yourself, address the factors that lead to crisis situations, and not take crisis personally. So if you are triggered is what I like to call. Aaron says plus implicit bias. Absolutely. And if you are triggered, if you have some things going on already and you change up how you're going to be approaching these crisis situations at work today, now you have then become a precipitating factor for someone else. Your behavior has now triggered the behavior in someone else. And they're going to go on about their day and they're going to be like, oh, now I'm really upset, right? Because Miss Siobhan, she made me mad because she came up in here doing all of this stuff. And now I'm set off. So another concept of this work when we think about it is rational detachment. Recognizing the need to remain professional by managing your own behavior and attitude. So we know that precipitating factors absolutely exist. I live in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. When it comes to getting to work, it can take a smooth 2 hours easily just to get to work. One crash, the sun shining too bright, maybe the wind was blowing too hard. Listen, that can take your 45-minute commute easily into like 2.5 hours. Then I'm like, oh, I'm running late because I didn't know traffic was going to be this bad. I'm upset. My baby was crying. He didn't feel whatever. All of these things that happen in my personal life on my way to work. Life is still happening because I am human. But there is this need where I have to recognize I have to rationally detach. I can't take all of the things into work with me. Right? So I need to be able to leave some of these things at the door, not take them personally, and keep these things in mind, right? What is the other person communicating? Because remember, all behavior is a form of communication. I know I'm agitated and irritated, but I have to take a step back and say, okay, Siobhan, leave those things outside. Think about what is this person trying to communicate? I need to, okay, Siobhan, how are you responding? I know you had a lot going on today, but do a check-in with me. Let me see, how am I responding? What am I expressing or conveying to this person? How are they responding to me? So just think about these things when we talk about rational detachment. You have to remember to leave those things at the door. I always tell people when you're going into work, I know life was happening to you, but once you walk through the door, leave those things outside the door. You can feel free to pick them up when you leave work, but all that you have going on, all of those, emotions and stuff, take a deep breath, try to take off some of that emotional baggage, leave it at the door. Like I said, if you want to pick it up by the time you leave work, knock yourself out. Because carrying a lot of that stuff into the workplace, it can cause us to respond negatively because, we're thinking about all the things that we have going on, which I'm not saying that those things aren't relevant, but don't allow them to impact and affect in a negative way the way that you respond to an individual in crisis. So here are some tips. Take a deep breath. Remember to choose your words carefully, and please feel free to ask for help. If it is just a day where you like, sweetheart, I have taken all deep breaths. I am trying so hard to use my words carefully, but it ain't working. I have meditated. I done said my affirmations. I done did my mantras. I done drank my coffee, right? Like I have woosah, none of it is working. Then you might need to ask for some assistance and have someone else come in. I always like to, call this the tag feature. It's like, tag, you're it. You need to tap in. I need to tap out. I need to tap out for a minute. So when we think about the integrated experience, I love this example because it's so true. This is an iceberg. If you've ever taken any type of training where we're talking about self-awareness or emotions and self-regulations, we see this a lot. This is an iceberg at the top above the water. Here's what we see. This is the known, right? These are all the things we know about a person in crisis. Oh, I know that, you didn't have a good day at school. I know that you're upset because, you're sitting next to a person you don't like. Okay, I know those things. But here's everything that's going on that is unspoken. There's so much that happens beneath the surface, which is why we have to be very careful when we're approaching people in a crisis situation and really approach them with empathy. Make sure that we're really approaching them with support. Make sure we're doing our check-ins. because there's so much that's happening underneath the surface. There's so much that's happening underneath the surface with us. This little tip of the iceberg, this is all I'm showing you today. I'm showing up as Siobhan, my trainer self, and here's what, I'm okay, tip of the iceberg. But even I have all of these things happening underneath the surface. It's the unknown. We all have these things that are brewing that maybe we don't talk about, but they're still relevant. They still exist. And we should still show empathy for people, even when it's stuff that we just don't know. All right, so I'm gonna skip past some of this because I really want to get into, here we go, our communication skills. So I am looking at the time and we are going to take a break at 10:30. All right, so let's start by, we talk about anxiety and that supportive behavior. So we're going to be talking about these different forms of communication: verbal, paraverbal, and nonverbal. So some communication considerations. You want to consider gender identity. You want to consider age. You want to consider culture. You want to consider cognitive functioning when you're talking about communication. When you're thinking about your postures, your gestures, how would you communicate with the person? Keeping all of these things in mind, in the forefront of your mind, right? Making sure that you're watching your words, making sure that, we think about, I love when it puts here cognitive functioning. That is absolutely true. We have to remember the processing skills that people have when we're talking to them. And sometimes that might play with age. Sometimes cognitive functioning has nothing to do with age, but that is something to keep into consideration. So with your verbal communication, make sure that it is short, simple, clear, respectful, and most importantly, positively phrased, right? We want to keep things always positively phrased. So instead of saying, "You're not supposed to be over here," you can say, "Oh, you seem lost. How may I help you? How may I assist you?" Instead of being very attacking, right? Just say, "All right, so you're in an area that you're not supposed to be. So how can I help you get back to, to where you're supposed to be?" That's short, simple, respectful, and it is positively phrased. We think about paraverbal communication. That's when we think about our tone, our volume, and our rhythm of speech. Checking your tone. Is your tone appropriate? Is your tone, a positive tone? Volume. Are you talking too loud? Are you talking too soft? And then your rhythm of speech. What's the cadence like? Are you speaking too slowly? Are you speaking too fast? These are all the things that we want to take into consideration. These are all of our paraverbal types of communication. Now, here's what I know. Tone absolutely can set a person off. Tone will set me off with somebody. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to be honest with you. Tone will definitely set me off with someone. If I feel like the tone is not right, I'll be honest, I will get defensive. That is when you will start to see some defensive behaviors from Siobhan. If, I feel like someone is approaching me with an inappropriate tone. I also don't like if I feel like someone's cadence, their rhythm of speech, if you are talking to me like this, really slowly with your words, personally, I'm going to feel like you are insinuating something. So rhythm of speech means something to me. So for me personally, I always try to remind myself, what's the tone that you have? What's the volume? Are you too loud, or are you speaking too softly? Are you whispering? Because if I'm whispering, if I'm just like, "Hey guys, can you hear me? We're gonna do this training. I'm gonna talk like this." Y'all gonna be like, "Lady, talk louder. I can't hear you." And that might be frustrating for some people if they're like, "Well, I can't hear you." What? Huh? What? So think about these things. Here are some communication tips for paraverbal communication. Use caring, supportive tones. Keep the volume appropriate to the situation. And deliver your message at a rate the person can process. Sometimes you might need to slow your words down because that person might need a little bit more processing time. When it's appropriate, please feel free to do that. If you feel like there may be a language barrier there, or a processing barrier, like you need some more processing time, feel free to slow down your speech. But make sure you do it at the appropriate time. It needs to be where that person can really process the message as well. Nonverbal communication, personal space, body language, communication through touch, and then listening with empathy. Here's a pop question. Personal space is what? The postures, gestures, facial expressions, and movement used to communicate. Personal space is a form of physical contact that expresses feeling or emotion. Or personal space is the distance people prefer to maintain between themselves and others. Which one is personal space? A, B, or C? Yes, it is C. Personal space is the distance people prefer to maintain between themselves and other. And we have seen how important personal space maybe can be with this whole social distancing thing, right? It's like stand 6 feet apart from one another. Give people their space because of, all the science behind why we should social distance. But social distance is the distance people prefer to maintain. So everyone's personal space might be different. Your personal space is different based on the audience, the people you're surrounding. You might have a smaller circle of personal space. You might allow people to be into your personal space if you know them. If you have, more of like a personal relationship with them, an intimate relationship with them, it's just like, yes, you can stand closer next to me. If it's somebody you might deal with typically in social settings, you might have a different definition of personal space. It might be like, oh, well, maybe I don't want you all up in my face, but it's okay for us to be, in close proximity with people. But then strangers, people you might not know, your circle of personal space is wider. It's like, all right, well, I definitely don't know you, so you might need to stay over there. So everyone has different zones for personal space based on the relationship. So here's the social zone that we talked about, right? Like, hey, what up? Like maybe you're a stranger danger. You see, so I would say this is probably 6 feet. Then we have the personal zone. You get a little bit closer. I know you. We friends, whatevs. And then, your intimate zone. Now, if we go through, I'm going to show you, go back. So look at this person, this guy over here. Look at how his body language changes for each zone. Hands out, arms to the side in the social zone. Like, hey, like I feel safe with you at that distance. Then in the personal zone, he changes his hands go in the pocket. Not really smiling as much. You're like, oh, you get a little close. And then the intimate zone. Look at this. His physical behavior here. We have arms crossed. We can see he's leaning back. We can tell, like, hey, he's a little bit more uncomfortable with this level of interaction. So what is body language? Body language is what? Posture, gestures, facial expressions, and movement used to communicate. A form of physical contact that expresses feelings or emotion, or the distance people prefer to maintain between themselves. What is body language? Everybody's saying body language is A. Actually, you are right. So it's the postures, right? Gestures, facial expressions that we use to communicate with one another. So when someone's anxious or defensive, how may their body language communicate this? So we know when someone is anxious or defensive, we saw the guy up there, your body language can really be all of this. You got a fake smile, the slouching, maybe avoiding contact because you're like, oh, I'm so uncomfortable. I don't want to look at you. Crossed arms. I see crossed arms a lot. Angling their body away from you, or like wringing their hands, playing with their hands, right? That's that fidgeting, that's that anxiety that we can see. So we know that if we see these things, that's someone communicating with their body that they might be a little uncomfortable. They're starting to get a little defensive. So I say, when you're thinking about approaching people in a crisis situation, think about your body language. Think about the physical space. Think about, and pay attention to that. Usually when we're in person, we actually do an exercise going through to see how people's their own personal body language changes when people start walking up to you and getting close to you. So an example that I like to use, I probably look really tall on camera, right? Like, oh, Siobhan looks like she's really tall. Maybe she's average height. No, in real life, I am 4 feet, 11 inches. I'm 5 feet with my shoes on. And I tell people this because I start getting anxious and start, exhibiting a lot of this body language when people start walking up on me. To me, everybody's taller than me because I'm not very tall. So I get really anxious and defensive when people who are taller than me starts getting really close to me. I don't like being in a large crowd because I'm so short. I kind of get lost in the crowd there. I start getting anxiety. I start getting really defensive, and my body language, I definitely start crossing my arms. I'll start, doing something with my hands or tapping my foot because that's me saying, "Ooh, I am a little uncomfortable with so many people around." So for me personally, I've recognized that that's kind of my first level is I see that anxiety developing. And I know I exhibit those behaviors when people start walking up on me, and I'm like, whoo, I'm starting to get uncomfortable. And sometimes it's not so noticeable. Sometimes it can be things like shoulders tense up. Like usually, like I said, when we do this in person, I am sitting there observing, and I encourage everyone to like get your partner and observe their body language. Start paying attention to the small things. It might be their jaw clenches, right? Their eyes get big or go small, or they might do something with their face. They might do something with their shoulders or their hands. Pay attention to those things because that's going to let you know when, all right, this is as far as maybe I need to go with this person when it comes to trying to be in their physical space. Or even pay attention to how you respond. Maybe you need to start speaking up and letting some of your the people you work with know this is, I feel more comfortable when we are at this distance, and that's okay. So, like I said, all of these things we can see in body language when people become defensive. All right, so communication through touch, which is haptics, is B, right? A form of physical contact that expresses feeling or emotion. So communication through touch, like I said, we also call that haptics. Communication through touch can provide, a comforting touch. Communication through touch can also communicate to someone that like we're angry. So I want you to think about all the ways that you may have seen or experience haptics. A hug. How do you define when someone gives you a hug? Some people might find comfort in hugging. I am not, to be honest with you, I'm not a hugger. So I really don't like people hugging on me. So for me, a hug, depending on who it's from, it's not very comforting. It's very uncomfortable. A slight touch on the shoulder, that might be, comforting enough to say, hey, I just want you to know I'm here with you. A handshake, right? A handshake might be the thing where it's just like, okay, we shook on it. I know we are now in agreement with it. Someone writes, Dolly writes, depending on someone's trauma, touch may be a trigger. Absolutely. Touch can definitely be a trigger. Like I said, I am not big on people touching me, especially people who I don't know. So that would definitely be a trigger for me. But there are certain touch points when someone is in crisis where it will communicate that, hey, I'm going to keep my distance, but I'm also want you to know that physically I am here with you. And so there are 3 different touch points. It says, someone says shaking hands and giving your name is a good way to start on the right foot. Absolutely. So there are 3 different touch points that we say are really can show that you're really supportive. The first touch point is just a hand on the shoulder, softly placing the hand on the shoulder. That is a touch point that might show someone, hey, I just want you to know I'm here for you. It's okay. I'm here with you. The other touch point is the elbow, for you to just softly cut the elbow and let you know, hey, I'm here for you. Just wanted to let you know I'm here. It's okay. And then the other touch point is the wrist, right? And now I want to say that you have to know the person in order to determine if haptics, if communication through touch is appropriate in the morning, in the moment. I'm not going to say always do this. You definitely want to use your existing knowledge of that person, depending on the relationship with them, to see if that level of touch is going to really calm them. Is it going to be more appropriate, or is it going to trigger them? But I did want to let you know there are 3 touch points: the shoulder, the elbow, and then the wrist. Right now, sometimes, for especially I see this with younger children, just gently kind of grabbing their holding their wrist. I'm not going to say grabbing, but gently holding the wrist kind of says, hey, it's okay, right? I'm here with you. Just a small, firm touch, that level of communication through touch, it can be calming to some people, especially I see this in younger children. It sounds weird, but it actually can be calming to say, like, I just want you to, I'm gonna give you just a small little squeeze here to let you know I'm here with you. It is okay. You can feel free to calm down. So those are our 3 different touch point areas. All right, it is 10:33. We're gonna go ahead and pause here because I do want to give you a small break. So I am going to give you a 7-minute break. Get up, stretch around. If that's what you need to do, I'm gonna put 7 minutes on my clock, on my timer here. Go grab you something to drink. I'm going to drink my water, and then we will hop right back in 7 minutes. All right. So 7-minute break starting now.